to 84850. Watch us on Global Player. Let me tell you who is on our panel tonight. We have Gary Smith, the General Secretary of the GMB Union. We have Sarah Jones, who's Labour MP for Croydon Central and Shadow Policing Minister, and Jim McMahon, who is Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA and MP for Oldham West and Royton. He is about to join us, I'm absolutely assured. So get your questions in 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, Sir Trapper on Twitter says, I don't understand cross-question tonight. 3 Labour MPs and a GMB unionist. Have LBC just given up even pretending to be impartial? Where is the balance coming from? Well, can I put it this way? Tory MPs are a bit short on supply at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, which is where we are. Next week, you won't find a single Labour MP on cross-question on Monday and Tuesday. So there's your balance. I had to say this at the beginning of the programme last night. Party conferences are exactly what they say on the tin. You have Labour MPs, you have trade unionists, you have Labour Party members and supporters, and the media. I suppose we could have had a couple of pundits on, but I think it's better to hear from politicians and trade unionists, don't you? Right, let's go to our first caller. It's Chris in Croydon. Chris, very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Oh, yes, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. My question is this. Could claiming to be heir to Blair be an electoral liability?
Are you suggesting that Keir Starmer said that? Because I don't think he did.
I thought he did. Or at least that's how he's been portrayed.
Because David Cameron always said he was the heir to Blair, and he then, sort of won the 2010 election, didn't he? Sarah Jones, let's come to you first. Could claiming to be the heir to Blair be an electoral liability?
Well, as you say, Ian, I don't think that is something that Keir said. I think what we've seen at conference is at a time when the country is going through a period of very significant change and uncertainty, you've got a clear voice from Keir Starmer about the kind of country we want to see, and a clear narrative about the way the Conservatives over the last 12 years have created low growth, low wages, all our public services really struggling, and the economic problems that we now face. And I think Keir, through talking about hope, really nailed exactly what people want. I had somebody, a young adult, said to me last week, do you really believe that things can get better? And I couldn't believe it, because when I was growing up, it didn't occur to you that things would get worse. And that's what Keir expressed today when he was in his Pebble Dash semi growing up. It didn't occur to his parents, even though it was difficult for him growing up, that things wouldn't get better. And that's what he wants to bring back to the country, that sense of hope. And he set out really clearly, very simply. It was totally his voice. This is how we're going to do it. And it was all about the climate and how we're going to get those dual jobs and tackle the climate in a really aspirational way that I think people will
there was
hear.
some sort of New Labour Blairite sort of sloganising, wasn't there? When he said New Britain, I thought he was then going to say New Labour, New Britain, New Britain, New Labour. And I just remember Tony Blair saying that was in 1996.
Well, there is one similarity. I mean, Yvette Cooper in her speech today, Shadow Home Secretary, she did say we are tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. However much we might try and come up with a better slogan, we can't, because that absolutely is what we're trying to do.
But Blair also described the centre ground as the political wing of the British people, as Starmer did today. So you can see why Chris is interpreting that as him claiming to be the heir to Blair. And I don't see why wouldn't he? Blair won 3 elections, and a lot of people in this place need to remember that.
Absolutely, but Keir Starmer's not Tony Blair, but what he is, and where there are massive similarities, is he is absolutely laser focused on winning an election. Everything else
is absolutely lazy then for a moment.
He's completely not lazy. He's absolutely laser focused on winning an election. Is the point that everything else really is a sideshow. And I think the sense that people are getting this week, that although we mustn't take anything for granted at all, the country are beginning to look to the Labour Party for answers where, as Peter Mandelson said today, you know, the Tories have had their turn. They've had 12 years. What have they done for the country? What good can you actually point to in that 12 years? And people are beginning to think, well, with the package of measures that we've announced today and through this week, the Green Prosperity Plan, which is incredibly ambitious, all of the announcements we made today on crime, bringing back neighbourhood policing, it's what people want to see and it's how people want their country to be run. So people are beginning to listen to what we've got to say and look to us for the answers.
A little bit of breaking news. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they've openly criticised Liz Truss this evening. They say, given elevated inflation pressures in many countries, including the UK, we do not recommend large and untargeted fiscal packages at this juncture, as it's important that fiscal policy does not work at cross purposes to monetary policy. Well, I wonder what the Chancellor's response to that will be. We may find out. You may want to ask about that. Gary Smith from the GMB, going back to the question, could claiming to be the heir to Blair be an electoral liability?
Well, Blair did win 3 elections and we do want to have a winning Labour Party again. But actually the situation Keir Starmer will inherit will be far worse than Blair and Brown inherited. The currency, the pound in our pocket, is being junked by the Tories. Our public services are in a state of collapse. Economic growth has flatlined over the past decade or more. Inequality has gone up. The share of wealth in the country is increasingly concentrated in the hands of the few. That budget, 90% of the benefit went to the top 5%. And we have an economy that's on its knees. And you know, we've made the point that Great British Engineering built this country and financial engineering's left it on its knees. And so Starmer faces a far tougher challenge. And I have to say that in terms of the Labour agenda, and we have our ups and downs with the Labour Party, absolutely, you expect me as a trade union leader to say that. But their agenda this week is so radical. Huge sums of money for care, low-paid care workers who are pennies above the minimum wage, who went through the pandemic, our members without PPE, can look forward to a better future. A publicly owned energy company, for goodness sake, going to give us the infrastructure. The renewables industry has failed to deliver the jobs that promised. We now have some hope in terms of that agenda. And on trade union rights, look at what the party is saying about collective rights and workers' rights. Starmer's putting his stamp on his party, and I have to say it's a pretty radical agenda.
Well, some more breaking news here. This is from the Press Association. Royal Mail workers are to take a further 19 days of strike action across October and November in a long-running dispute over pay and conditions. That's been announced by the CWU, the Communications Workers Union. They have a stand literally 2 stands away from here. Dave Ward was going to be coming on our programme tonight, but he said he had a meeting to discuss exactly that. Gary, I imagine you support the CWU on this. Do you think Keir Starmer does?
That's a question for Keir Starmer, not for me. Absolutely 110% behind the postal workers and the Communication Workers Union, the action they're taking. And let's be clear, that service, the postal service, is likely to be sold off on the cheap. And the universal service that we get through the post is now under threat, and Labour are going to have to face into that. And I'd much rather be working with Dave and the CWU, working with Labour ministers to try and resolve those problems and find a way forward, including, I hope, a publicly owned postal service. And can I say this point about selling of the post office? Because the pound is tanking, we are going to see vulture capitalists moving into the UK and buying up British companies on the cheap. That's going to be bad for jobs, it's going to be bad for research and development, bad for the long-term growth of the country. And I don't think people have quite woken up yet to the full extent of the threat this tanking of our currency, junking our currency actually means.
Jim McMahon, who is Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, MP for Oldham West and Royton, has joined us. Jim, we'll come on to the question that Chris asked in a minute, but just on the communication workers dispute, do you support the union on their dispute?
It's pretty clear that Royal Mail need to do far, far more to win the trust of their workforce, and over quite a long period of time, they haven't treated their workforce with the respect that they are due. I speak to my postie on a regular basis, and I can say that they are amongst the most hard-working frontline public sector workers that you will ever see. They go out in the wind, the rain, the snow, and all they're asking for is to be treated fairly by their employer and to be paid fairly. And it's completely legitimate for any trade union to lead their workforce into a negotiation on that basis. And so, my plea for Royal Mail is get round the table, find a solution that prevents strike action being required. But if employers aren't willing to do that and they're not willing to move ground, then of course every worker has the right to withdraw their labour.
So you support the strike?
But as a matter of principle, workers have the right to withdraw their labour.
But I'm just asking, on this particular dispute, do you support the strikes?
I hope it can be avoided, and I hope that Royal Mail get round the table and compromise far more than they have today.
Do you support the strikes? I don't understand why you can't answer that question. You either do or you don't.
But the principle of strike, of course, I support, but nobody wants a strike, including, by the way, the people that will be forced onto the picket line if Royal Mail don't meet them halfway. And so that's a call, isn't it? No worker goes to work deliberately to walk back out onto the picket line. They go to work to earn a living for their friends.
They have made the decision to go on strike. I imagine it'll be supported by the overwhelming majority of their members.
And it certainly wouldn't be in a decision that they take.
No, I'm not suggesting it would, but there will be picket lines in your constituency. Will you be joining them?
What I'm going to be working for, and I should say, I support the right of workers to withdraw their labour if negotiations break down and the employer isn't willing to negotiate and to compromise and to treat them with respect. Where I'm concerned, though, is to make sure that I do my utmost in the position that I've got to work hard for a Labour government, because what I don't want to do, and I do think there is something in the kind of current environment where employers think they can get away with this because they have the explicit consent of the government to do it. And they wouldn't have that with a Labour government. We support workers. We've been very clear today about.
But if you support workers, why wouldn't you join them on the picket line? I mean, I know why, because you're both front benchers. You've got an edict from the leader that you're not allowed to do that, and yet even under Tony Blair, I don't remember any edicts from the Blair government saying that Labour MPs weren't allowed to join a picket line. OK, it was different. They were in government, so ministers automatically wouldn't have joined a picket line, but you're not in government, so you should be able to.
Well, I mean, I set my case out, and I'm not going to make any more of it than it is, other than to say and to repeat what I've just said, which is that Royal Mail need to do far more to respect their workforce, to find a compromise that resolves the strike action, and to repeat that no worker wants to go out on strike. That they are forced to go out on strike is a sign of an employer that isn't doing the right thing.
Right, Jeremy Paxman hat will come off now, you'll be glad to hear. So let's go back to Chris's question. Could claiming to be the heir to Blair be an electoral liability?
Well, listen, Tony Blair was a winner, and I'd like a bit of that, frankly. What Tony Blair did successfully was to tap into the public mood at that time and to come up with solutions to the problems of the day. We're not in that time, we're not in that day. The environment is very different, the politics are very different, the economy is very different. And so Keir Starmer is not trying to be Tony Blair, but he is trying to win for the Labour Party and to win for Britain. What he set out today, genuinely, I have been absolutely astounded by. First of all, it's a plan for Britain, and it's a plan for working people.
Hang on, you're in the shadow cabinet. How could you be astounded by it?
Because there are two elements for me, and I'm speaking as a working class lad who's found his way into politics. To hear somebody talk about the aspiration and what makes working people tick, for me, really struck at my heart. Why do working people work so hard? It's to provide a better life for themselves and for their family. But for too many people, they work, they do everything that's asked for them, but they're not able to get on, they're not able to get by. And then the fear sets in that your children, your grandchildren will have an even worse chance than you did. When you think about the state of the housing market, the state of public services, when you think about the state of our employment market, genuinely, I'm fearful for the next generation and the one that goes before if we don't see a Labour government. And so for Keir to lay out the plan about how he will reset Britain and make that offer to the British people is compelling, but I expected that. That's policy, and that's been worked up over a long period of time. For him to speak from the heart about what it means to be a working family in Britain, trying to get by without pride and respect and to rebuild for the next generation, genuinely I thought was outstanding.
Right, we will take more of your calls in a moment to our panel. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
18 minutes past 8. With me in Liverpool, Sarah Jones, who's Labour's Shadow Policing Minister, Jim McMahon, Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, which stands for, and I think I might have got this wrong, it's Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. That is
perfect.
Right, isn't it? Thank
God
God
for that.
Star. Excellent. And Gary Smith is General Secretary of the GMB. What does GMB stand for, Gary? Just testing you?
It's just an acronym now. It used to be the General Municipal Boilermakers, but we're just a big general union, so it's just a logo.
Now, a text question here. It doesn't actually give a name. It says, would it not be safer to host Eurovision in Ukraine rather than Glasgow? Gary, I have to put this to you as being the token Scot on the panel.
I'm also from Edinburgh, so I'll be very, very careful, but I live in the west coast of Scotland. I drink in Glasgow, so I'm going to pass on that one.
Well, that's not what you said in the break.
They should have brought it to Paisley, where I currently reside.
Of course, the short list is now Glasgow and Liverpool. So would you pick Glasgow over Liverpool, given that you are now sat in Liverpool, Gary?
I would pick Liverpool, because if it's in Glasgow, it'll inconvenience me, I'm sure, in terms of getting outside the city.
Selfish. Sarah, are you a Eurovision fan?
I can't say I'm a massive Eurovision fan. I'd like the idea of hosting it here, but hosting it in Croydon, that would be perfect, wouldn't it?
Never going to happen.
You'd flop.
Never gonna
Everyone would flop.
No, Jim. Fairfield Hall's not quite big enough.
It's huge.
It is huge.
Got an amazing acoustic.
I've performed there with Jenny Murray and Anne Widdicombe, believe it or not. Jim.
Oh, this is a very difficult one, actually. Obviously it should be Manchester, and the fact that it's not is outrageous. And we're in Liverpool, which is a beautiful city with beautiful facilities, and of course the Albert Dock is iconic. There is something though quite special about Glasgow. I do kind of find when I visit and you get off the station at Queen Street, you do get a sense of both grandeur but also a tint of Mancunian architecture when you get off that kind of industrial heritage. I think is quite nice.
It hasn't quite got Liverpool's musical heritage, has it?
Well, you could say that.
I just did.
Obviously, I would say the UK is stronger by all of our musical contributions.
You drink in the pubs I drinking in Glasgow. It's a good musical heritage.
Okay, all right, I trust you. Right, let's go to a much more serious question from Mohammed in South Shields. Hello, Mohammed.
Hiya, you're all right.
Hi.
Hiya, sir. My question is, with Labour concentrating so much on the green this and green that and green the other, do you honestly think that's enough to get them to win the next general election? Because I don't, Ian, I really don't. I just don't see any fight in Sir Keir. I just think, does he really want the job in the very beginning to be Labour leader,
Well, he stood, didn't he? So you have to assume that he did. Well, let's go to Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for the Environment, Jim McMahon.
So, listen, if we want to repatriate those decent, skilled, working-class jobs that were the foundation of many of our regional economies, including in the North East, then we've got to put the money in. We've got to invest in those foundations once again. But we're not bringing back the mines. We're not bringing back the cotton mills of Oldham. We're investing in a new future. And the new future is in energy security and the environment. It's about renewables, onshore and offshore. It's about solar. It's about nuclear. Those provide people with a really decent lifestyle, a good standard of living. And I would just say this, working people for so long have been told just to accept your lot. The kind of secure job at the past that had a nice pension towards the end of it is something that your parents might have had, not something for the future. And what Labour's saying is our vision for work, our vision for Britain, is about having a decent quality of life for working people, where everyone gets to share the benefits of what we create together. And so it's being badged as this green intervention because that is a climate emergency, the climate crisis that we have. And I would just say this, from a DEFRA point of view, I do think we have a generational responsibility to make sure that we hand over the country to the next generation in a better condition than we found it. And quite frankly, we exploit our country. We dump raw sewage in our rivers, in our seas, in our open spaces. We allow mass pollution, whether it's on land or in the air, in a way that not only disrespects our country, but also makes our people ill. And I just say that I want my children to grow up in a country where they can breathe in clean air without fear of dying early because of the pollutions in the air. I want them to enjoy the local country park without fear that raw sewage is coming down the local stream because the water companies aren't being held to account. I want them to get on the housing ladder and have a decent job that allows them to get the mortgage and a house that's then affordable that they can actually purchase. And I want them beyond that to go on holiday and enjoy life and to thrive and to feel that they're fulfilled. And that's exactly what's been laid out today. It's a plan for working people as much as the environment.
I think what Mohammed might be pointing to is that maybe this is seen as a really important subject by sort of the liberal left, but it's not a subject that gets people talking down Gary's pub in Paisley.
I've never been accused of being liberal left before, but what I am is straightforward, common sense, working class. And I'm telling you that when I go back to Oldham, working class people are demanding better, and working class people are organising. And what Keir said today about the Labour Party being the political arm of working people is absolutely right. Working people need somebody on their side, and it's not the Tories. Just see what happened on Friday. Where would you sooner put billions and billions of pounds into the oil and gas companies, into billionaires and millionaires, or into the pockets of working people with decent jobs? Okay. We choose something different than the Tories.
Gary Smith, down your local Dog and Duck, is this all they're talking about, sort of green policies, net zero?
Well, if you look at our track records as a trade union, we have been enormously critical of elements of Labour's approach to energy because we've been too long, the Liberal left has been talking down to working class communities. And the truth is, we have all these wind farms all down the east coast of the UK, Scotland all the way down. Nearly everything has been manufactured in China using coal, in the United Arab Emirates, in yards that are supported by sovereign oil and gas wealth funds, or in yards in Spain that are state-backed. There has been no jobs for working class communities in the offshore or onshore wind, and all that people have seen is their bills going up. And the party has been slow to recognise this fact and be honest about it. And our union's got a track record on fighting for these jobs and calling this out. Biden in America, what's interesting, he's changed his approach and seems to be winning because they've stopped talking to communities and started working with trade unions and communities to deliver real jobs. The fastest growth in manufacturing industry in America since the 1970s, because it isn't all liberal left agenda, it's working class communities getting opportunities. But I would say this to the callers, having been so critical of Labour, listen today what was said about a great British energy company. We're going to have a chance to genuinely create jobs, to get people upskilled. We're going to stop the rip-off that's going on with the renewables industry. We've got the chance of a new deal for working people and to rebuild our energy infrastructure. There's no doubt about it. And finally on energy, let me say this, because it's not all been bad news for Labour either. Hinkley Point was a Labour and trade union project. It's the biggest construction site in Europe, the new nuclear plant there. There'll be 10,000 skilled workers at that plant. We need a national plan for energy. Gas is going to be with us for a long time, whether we like it or not, whether people in the party leadership want to face it. We're going to have to get that from somewhere. But we've got a chance, a national plan for energy, and we've got a chance finally to get real jobs into working class communities, and that's fantastic.
What about real jobs in the fracking sector? Because the government have announced the end of the fracking ban. What's your view on that?
We've been fracking offshore for decades. So when people tell me it's not safe, but it's safe to do hundreds of miles out in the North Sea, we've been doing it for decades. We've been fracking onshore in the UK for decades. We import huge amounts of frack gas from America. We import ethane that's fracked from America. It supports our vital manufacturing industries. So there needs to be a more grown-up and honest debate about fracking, because ultimately we have a choice. The Tories' policy on energy, they're responsible for this energy crisis. They hard-baked...
Well, to be fair, Putin is.
Well, no. The Ukraine war is hard-baked in a crisis in our energy sector. Bills were going up. Every nuclear power station in the UK, bar one, will be off by 2030. That means bills are going to go up. We will lose another coal-fired power station next year. The Tories have neglected our energy needs for a long time. Now, we just need a sober and honest debate about gas, and in my view, we should take responsibility for our own carbon emissions. For too long, by the way, we've been exporting our responsibilities, exporting our jobs actually, and importing virtue. We want real jobs in working class communities.
I mean, Sarah, I don't want you to repeat everything. You're both on Labour's front bench, so I don't want you to just repeat what Jim has said. But let's pick up something that Gary said there about fracking, because fracking has become a real political football. Now, we can all have a debate about the safety and all the rest of it. But when Ed Davey was Climate Change or Energy Secretary back in 2013, he was saying, rather what you've said there, that we mustn't demonise fracking. Just because it's new doesn't mean to say that it's a bad thing. And yet he's now decided that it's the most terrible thing of all. And most politicians on your side of the fence seem to agree with that. And yet we've heard Gary here put forward the case for it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't, Gary knows what he's talking about. I'm not going to say we shouldn't be listening very hard to what he's saying. What Ed Miliband was saying is that it's not going to help with the prices because gas is sold on the international market and we'd have to be fracking a huge amount in order to make a difference to energy costs. And he has been pointing to the unknowns in terms of safety. I mean, interestingly, I was on a programme with a Conservative MP, a 2019 MP, and he was not keen. I mean, this is very difficult politically for the Conservatives because they are not.
Issue, should it?
I'm slightly baffled as to why the government have suggested that, and I think what I'd say to Gary is we have to work together on how we make all this work, but there is such a big package through the Great British Energy Package that we're announcing today, and this is a kind of British-owned power generation that can be transformational and is.
But why couldn't fracking be a small part of that? Because
there is
although you say it wouldn't affect prices, over the long term, it could contribute, 2-5% of our energy needs. And surely the best way to achieve energy security is to have a broad basket of different types of energy feeding into it, rather than relying purely on one.
Well, look, we've said we want to be a clean energy superpower by 2030. It's a big ambition. You're absolutely right. We need to use as many different means as possible.
Very Boris Johnson language there, wanted to be an energy superpower.
Well,
boosterism.
Well, we want to be ahead of the game, and I think Keir was actually, it was really important the way he spoke today in his speech. He was really ambitious for Britain. He was saying, why on earth shouldn't we be at the head, at the head of all the other countries on these things? We should be ambitious, and we've said we're going to double onshore wind, we're going to triple solar, quadruple offshore wind. There is a whole plethora of plans there. So I'm not saying I am an expert. I'm putting forward the arguments that we've said, but I think the ambition behind the Great British Energy plans that we announced today, alongside those ambitions to insulate our homes, that will bring down prices for everybody, as well as give us national security, because we'll be creating our own energy. It will retain wealth for the country because it's going to be British owned, and we'll get clean power and jobs as well. It's a pretty ambitious I think speaks because of the fact it could be around the whole country as well. We're talking about opportunities everywhere because of the geography of the country and the energy that we're looking at. So it really is, I think, something that hopefully people will look at and see. It's about jobs just as much.
Okay, Gary, you wanted to come back?
One of the reasons our emissions are so low in the UK is because we exported so much of our manufacturing work to China, who ironically burn a huge amount of coal, and then we import the manufactured goods back on diesel burning ships. If you listen to Rachel Reeves yesterday about economic policy, and if you do have a look at the Great British Energy Company proposals, we have a chance to create a British energy company, but also to bring manufacturing jobs home. If you want to tackle the climate crisis, we have to stop exporting jobs, stop importing virtue, bring our jobs home.
Right, we'll come to more of your calls in just a moment. 0345 6060973 if you'd like to put your question to our panel. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC, or hopefully watching it on Global Player. It's 8:32, news headlines with Lottie Morley.
Royal Mail workers say they will stage a further 19 days of strikes in October and November. The Communication Workers Union says the action will cover busy periods like Black Friday and the Christmas build-up. Sir Keir Starmer says it's Labour's moment during his party conference speech in Liverpool. The party leader accused the government of losing control of the economy and announced plans on energy and the NHS. And the Bank of England has signalled a significant monetary policy response will be needed to stabilise the pound. Its chief economist has been responding to the historic drop in the pound against the dollar after Friday's mini-budget. LBC weather, showers remaining in northern Scotland tonight and along western and eastern coasts, clear elsewhere with a low of 4.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:35 on LBC. With us on the Cross Question panel, Sarah Jones, Shadow Policing Minister, Jim McMahon, Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, and Gary Smith, General Secretary of the GMB Union. Let's go to Howard in Greenford for our next question. Hi, Howard.
Hi. Good evening. In view of the standing ovation that Keir Starmer got during his speech when he mentioned that anti-Semitism should be eradicated from the Labour Party, should Ruva Huck be had the whip taken away from her permanently, considering the comments she made about the Chancellor today?
Well, let's just remind us of what she said. This was a fringe meeting at the Labour Party conference. She was recorded as saying, "I'm sorry if I was not making myself understood clearly. He, i.e. Kwasi Kwarteng, superficially is a black man. He went to the top schools in the country. If you hear him on the Today programme, you wouldn't know he's black." She also made a comment about Rishi Sunak of a similar nature. Now, Graham in Bushy has got a supplementary question to this. He says, with Ruva Huck having the whip withdrawn today and Naomi Wimborne-Idrisi being suspended from the NEC last week, is Labour still a racist party? Gary, let's come to you first.
I've not seen the comments, but what...
I just read them out.
Yeah, I've not seen the story in detail. But when somebody says something like this that is totally inappropriate, utterly wrong, it needs to be dealt with decisively, and I think Labour has done that. What they didn't do with anti-Semitism is root this poison out, and I was really pleased with the position that Keir Starmer has taken and the action he's taken over anti-Semitism. And it's so important to us as a union because we have Jewish members, and there is a long, proud Jewish history in the trade union movement, and including in our own union. And to watch that poison be allowed to go on in the party under Corbyn, as it was truly shameful. So Starmer deserved a standing ovation today. I'm delighted with the action he took over anti-Semitism. We have set up recently a Jewish faith workers branch. I hope the Jewish community has faith in us as a union. I think they do. And I'm glad that when something like this happens, when comments are made like this, there's decisive action taken.
And Sarah, of course, the last thing that any party wants, and certainly a party leader wants, on the day of the party leader's speech, is something like this to crop up. And I mean, to be fair, it hasn't overshadowed the speech, but I think there are some important things to discuss here in what kind of disciplinary action should be taken against somebody who does this. And Gary's absolutely right. It was done very relatively quickly, I think within a couple of hours. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding was, as soon as this came to light, action was taken and Rupa's been suspended. I mean, we have to have the highest standards. We're trying to run a country, we're trying to stand for government, and we will have the highest standards, and that means that we need to act fast if people say things of this nature which are completely
Do you think she should, as the questioner says, Howard, do you think that she should have the whip withdrawn permanently?
Well, the whip's decisions are not mine. I'm glad that there was swift action, and we'll see what process happens. But we have to send a clear message to the country that this is not the kind of thing that we would expect in our party.
It's been described as racial gatekeeping, where you can only be considered truly black or brown or whatever if you adhere to a certain view, and if you go away from that view, you're somehow not a proper black person, which is probably a very clumsy way of putting it. But I mean, that surely is something that we need to get rid of completely, that attitude.
I absolutely agree. I don't have anything to add other than that's perfectly true. And it's very disappointing to see such things. As Gary said, Keir's been really strong about needing to root out anti-Semitism, and that needs to apply for all forms of racism and discrimination in our party, no exceptions.
Jim?
I think, to be fair, the Chancellor's given plenty of material to attack him on without going to that level of personal attack. This was the person who was seen laughing during the funeral of the Queen, the person who refused to allow the OBR...
It was during the funeral. It was
during the service
before it started in Windsor.
It was during the service of the funeral while they were waiting for the service to begin, as I understand.
Yeah, but that was
he refused to allow the OBR to present an independent economic assessment of his budget. He gave a £60 billion bung to oil and gas giants. He gave rich people a huge tax cut at the same time hitting working people struggling to make ends meet. He has given plenty of material to go out and to criticise without being personal. And I think the wider point actually about how we conduct ourselves in public life and political life is very important. At times a lot of us find politics very hostile. And what we all need to do is to invest time to raise the bar of respect mutually, whether we agree or not, and to put policies first and to disagree on policy and not personality and get to this level of abuse.
Because most Labour politicians have actually welcomed the fact that there is a much more diverse look to this Conservative cabinet, and that the last three chancellors have either been Asian or black. I mean, that is something I think everybody ought to, whether you disagree with them politically or not, it doesn't matter. But that is a cause for celebration, I would have thought. It's certainly not something that I would have envisaged even 5 or 10 years ago.
It's not really something I thought about, other than the fact that he so far has been
I'm mistaken, it's 4, not 3. I've forgotten Nadeem Zahawi. But he was only there a month.
He was only there 5 minutes.
It keeps moving around. It's so difficult to find out what job he's doing at the moment. But that general point around, there's plenty to go at in the last week, not least of all the pound crashing and all that's causing, without getting into that. And obviously, none of us can get into the whip's decision. There is a very clear line where we can't go over on that. But the principle about respect and good discourse in public life, I think we all agree to.
Let's go back to our caller, Howard. Howard, you clearly think that she should never get the whip back. Isn't that a bit dramatic? She has now apologised.
Yeah, thank you. I've just listened to 3 members of the party. Now, I happen to be Jewish myself, and not one of them has answered the very question that I asked. Should the whip be withdrawn? And what they've done is they've got off the point, they haven't answered it, and I'm disappointed in them.
Well, to be fair, I think they all did answer it and say that they thought the whip should have been withdrawn, but 2 of them are front benchers and they can't really comment on whip's decision. So I think we kind of have to forgive them for that, Howard. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Let's go to Jeremy in Bury St Edmunds. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello, Ian. Love your podcast, by the way.
Thank you very much indeed. I had a lot of people here saying they love the For the Many podcast, so that's good. What would you like to ask, Jeremy?
I called in because you've got Jim McMahon, but it's obvious to the whole panel as well. I'm a farmer, livestock farmer from Suffolk, and one thing that I think many people may be very surprised to learn is that we have lower levels of food security than even energy security, which is pretty topical at the moment. And in my opinion, the most damaging neglect that's been in government policy in recent years has been to ignore food production. And I would like to ask, how will Labour restore that? And might a good start be to put the F for farming back into DEFRA like it used to be with maths?
Oh, no, there's a controversial one. Look, Jim, I'm going to give you the bulk of the time on this because it is your responsibility, but if the other two want to chip in at the end, then absolutely fine.
I think the problem with this conversation with a farmer and somebody that's
by the way, I'm a farmer too.
Well, due respect for you for that, Ian. And somebody that's become an adopted farming geek, is that this can get into quite a detailed conversation about the structure of food security and farming in the country. What we'll say is this, we do need to have a land plan for England. The very fact that we don't have a plan for how we use the land that we have to manage is part of the problem. And so we are seeing at the moment that, very productive agricultural land is being lost to essentially investors that are buying those family farms up and using them to plant conifers. So we're losing really good food land in favour of conifers that will be chopped down in a couple of years. It makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, it must make financial sense to them.
But it doesn't make sense for food security, and it doesn't make the best use of the land that we've got for the type of land in the particular location. I would say this, farmers have had such a difficult time, not just over the last year, but over the last period. They were hit by the HGV driving crisis and the way that pushed up the cost of transportation. They've been hit by increased oil costs. Those that are off-grid in particular really do feel the pain of being able to heat the buildings on the farm and the houses. But then also the input costs on fertiliser, on CO2, on feed, all those costs have been stacking up. And then on top of that, the government are able to negotiate a Brexit that makes matters even worse by having a labour shortage on top. And so, farmers have had such a difficult time, and when they've looked to government to try and help them, the government haven't been there. So what have we tried to do as a constructive opposition is to say, well, first of all, you could intervene on the fertiliser market, because we have fertiliser plants in the UK that are closed because the cost of energy outstrips what the market is able to tolerate in terms of price. Why not intervene, provide support for that market that allows farmers to buy fertiliser at a reasonable cost to be able to grow the food that we need? The funding scheme ELMS, which is a scheme that generally gives direct payments to farmers along as nature projects, is currently underspent because not enough people are going into the new scheme for a number of reasons that I won't go into. But essentially, they are holding a pot of money there that could be used to extend direct payments to allow a fairer transition for farmers that get them through the cost of living crisis and ensure food security.
Doesn't the fact that we're now outside the Common Agricultural Policy really offer an opportunity to Britain, I'm not saying the government or farmers, but generally, to develop a new farming strategy where we don't have to obey all the rules that come from Brussels, we can develop our own strategy. That for you, as somebody who wants to be a Secretary of State in 2 years, I mean, you've got 2 years to develop that plan, haven't you?
Yeah, so the starting point is a land use framework, which sounds very boring, but it's very important. The second one is how do we use the money that comes through DEFRA to make sure that we support, in conjunction, farming and food production, nature and the environment, and making sure that we meet our climate change objectives. But more broadly, how do we secure our food security? And the very fact that the government at the moment don't have an eye on food security across the whole supply chain means that actually we're very vulnerable in the way that's been expressed by the caller. So we are working up a plan. It will be a far more ambitious plan than the government's got. And I'll just say this, the government announced only 24 hours ago that they were going to throw the Elm Scheme into the air and just see what happened. It caused absolute chaos with farmers.
What is the Elm Scheme? Just explain.
So this is the environmental land management scheme. It's a funding scheme that replaced direct payments to farmers. And in addition to farming and food production, it's now got to address nature and the environment.
But Minette Batters, as I understand it, the head of the NFU, has supported the abolition of that scheme, and The Guardian is claiming that farmers are quitting the NFU because of that. What's your comment on that?
Well, I was with Minette yesterday. I was with the National Farmers Union during a panel debate yesterday, and they are very clear about their position. They support continued financial support for farmers for the reasons that we've said about cost of living crisis.
Not that scheme, not on the nature element of it.
Well, I don't think anyone supports the current scheme. It's an orphan scheme. It doesn't have the support of farmers or the nature environmentalist movement. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to have a plan that deals with food security, how we deal with the natural environment, how we deal with rewilding, and how we support the environment and wildlife. And there is a plan that can be worked up. But what DEFRA do and what the government do is to set the farming community against nature and the environment community. And what we say is the real answer is bringing all those interests together and finding a bridge across the matters where there might be difference.
Well, Minette Batters is going to be joining us on Cross Question from the Tory Party conference next week, so I'll put some of that to her. Any brief comments from either of you?
Food
Gary?
security, like energy security, is a cornerstone of national security, and both have been neglected for far too long. You mentioned fertiliser. Does take us back to the earlier point about energy, because gas is an important feedstock in our chemical manufacturing, which is about making fertilisers as well. So this whole debate about energy is really complex because it feeds directly into what we eat.
Sarah, anything?
Nothing to add on food production. Obviously, Jim knows his stuff. I'd just say about being a farmer and living in rural areas, and my brief, crime has been rising pretty fast. Machinery theft, if you're a farmer, is really high. Hair coursing, poaching, no police because they've all been cut. It's a really, it's a difficult climate across the board. I was with a group of farmers and anglers and shooters yesterday. We were talking about the need for a lot more care and attention in rural areas in general, whether it's food production and farming or crime.
Somebody's desperate to know what crops or livestock are grown on my farm. Wheat, barley and beans, and that's it. No livestock because my dad had to sell them all when we joined the common market in 1973, so there you go. Right, more questions in a moment. It's 8:49.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
So Mark Rayleigh, new Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. If you were a young woman who regularly walked the streets of London late at night, would you feel safe, Commissioner?
I can't put myself in the mind of a young woman. Many women feel safe in London a lot of the time, but too often they don't. But most of all, the thing the police can bring to this is very clear focus on the men who predate on women and children.
But would you be happy for your daughters or your granddaughters to walk the streets of London?
Yes, I would be.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:53 on LBC. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Mark in Sevenoaks. Hello, Mark.
Hello. I'd like to ask how much better off will we be under Labour's version of Brexit than accepting the EU's offer of just reversing it?
I wasn't aware the EU had made that offer, Mark. Have they?
The EU Parliament voted 6-1 in favour of a confirmatory referendum in February, and I was told on an EU phone line that it was the policy given by the 27 to the negotiators, and that would last as long as negotiations were going on, even after the end of the transition period.
OK, well, news to me. Gary, what's your view on that?
I think it goes back to the points that Rachel Reeves was talking about yesterday, the Shadow Chancellor. What I get from Labour over the past couple of days is there's an opportunity for a Labour government to be more interventionist, but for the British public to gain from tax monies that are spent. So at the moment, the energy companies, for instance, have been given a blank cheque by the Tory government. In future, with the Great British Energy Company, you will see the British taxpayer taking a stake within industries where we invest, and that can only be the right thing to do. And if you look at what Rachel Reeves was saying yesterday, I think far more interventionist and really supporting British industry and British manufacturing. I think Brexit has been, we were sold something that was going to be so simple and so easy. It hasn't been. And any opportunity that we were supposed to be derived from it, the extra money for the NHS, support for industry, that's just never arrived. And actually tanking the economy in the way that the Tories have, and as I said earlier, will make British industry, British companies that should be delivering wealth and growth in the economy, make them much more vulnerable to takeover. So I think Labour's vision, it feels very, very different from what we've got at the moment.
I should explain that the laughter you can hear in the background is not people laughing at Gary's answer. I don't know what they're laughing at, but there's some fringe meeting going on just down the hall, so it's not totally outside our control. Sarah?
I agree with Gary. I think the other thing that Brexit brought, whatever side of the argument you picked, was great instability for a long period of time. And what Rachel and Keir have talked about so much this week is, business needs security. We need a period of stability, and to have a Chancellor who is very clear about what we will borrow and how we will pay for our public services, how we will work with trade unions and with businesses to invest and grow our economy is such a change from the instability and the lurching from crisis to crisis that we've had under this government, that I think that will bring economic benefits in and of itself. Business can say, well, we know the direction of travel that the government want to take this country in. We know that they're going to create the skills that we need for the jobs that we want to produce, and that will be a huge change to what we've seen over recent years.
Jim?
Well, we have to deal with what we will inherit when we come into office, and obviously I hope that's sooner than later. But we don't know where we'll be at that point. The primary concern for me is making sure that we secure the future of Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And by the way, we have no chance whatsoever of securing a trade deal with the US if we don't do that. So that's got to be a priority for a whole range of reasons. But also the spirit in which we enter into negotiations. The EU are not our enemies, they're our friends. The relationship that we've had over such a long period of time, culturally, economically, for me is really important, and I don't want to see that to be diminished. And so the question is, how do you stand on your own 2 feet away and not being a member of the EU, have a solid trading relationship, a social relationship, but one that allows Britain to invest back into its own economy so people really do see the benefits of a government that's on their side. And I think, for many people, they weren't really voting, in my view, and my experience speaking to a lot of people, about just leaving an institution that was the EU. People were sick and tired of being told that's just the way it was, that the economy was going downhill, that the jobs were being lost, that life chances were being lost as well, and that was just the way it was, and people voted for a reset. And what Keir set out to actually in the speech was that reset. He acknowledged the cause of Brexit and the driver and why people voted for it, and offered a real solution about how we can build back. But I think that issue of good faith and really finding common ground with our partners, I think, is very important.
Of course, the biggest cheer he would have got this afternoon is if he'd said something along the lines of, well, I know that I've said that we are going to make Brexit work, but a future Labour government will reapply to join the single market. I mean, that would have got the biggest cheer in this hall, wouldn't it?
I don't think it would have done. I think we all want to make Brexit work. We all want to move on and make the country the best country it can be. And that's the message people wanted to hear. And that's what Keir delivered this afternoon. I think that argument has passed, and it's how do we make it work, and how do we make good the mess that this government has made of all their negotiations.
Final text question from Sarah in Southall, who says, if you were leader of a political party and you were making your leader's speech and you could announce any policy that you wanted, what would it be? And I suspect Gary's going to give the most entertaining answer here, because the other two will have to think, I don't know if I can say that.
Yeah, well, I could talk a bit. Yeah,
go on.
No.
That's my answer too.
I'm a trade unionist. I passionately believe in trade union rights and trade union organisation, because people coming together, collective organisation, workers having the power of unity and able to negotiate over their pay and conditions is not just good for workers, it's good for our society, because it ensures that wealth is distributed more fairly.
This is supposed to be a fun question, Gary.
But I've got to stay on message, I'm afraid. And, mine would be about trade union rights, or maybe a state-sponsored football team in Edinburgh, my team Hibs. Maybe that would be the thing I would do.
Jim?
Well, obviously, I've got the benefit, being in the Shadow Cabinet, of putting forward some ideas, and some of those have been adopted, and we're working up some others that I think are really exciting in terms of environment and nature. In addition to being a member of the front bench, I also chair the Cooperative Party, which is Labour's sister party, and something I'm very proud of. I believe in a cooperative economy, and what I would like to see is a real expansion of the cooperative economy, where people in communities come together, and what they create together, they get the benefit of on the back end. That value stays in the local community. I think it's often underestimated, but actually a significant part of our economy, and could do more.
Sarah, it's up to you to provide the fun in the fun text question at the end of the programme.
Oh gosh, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. Let's make Croydon a city. That's my
that's a good one.
That's what we've been calling for a while. Yeah.
How big is Croydon? How many people?
It's got about 400,000.
Has it got a cathedral?
It's got a minster. It's got a bishop.
It has got a bishop. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Case closed.
There we go.
Okay, well,
I'm not sure whose decision
I was going to say the Queen had better agree, but of course it's the King that must agree now, isn't it? It's been very entertaining. Thank you all three for coming on the programme. That's Jim McMahon, Gary Smith and Sarah Jones. Right, coming up in a moment, we're going to return to one of the questions that we discussed a little earlier about the withdrawing of the whip from the Labour MP Rupa Huq over some comments she made about the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. So do stay tuned for that if you want to give your view. 0345 6060 973. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Sir Keir Starmer says the UK must never forgive the government for crashing the economy. The Labour leader has been addressing the party's